Before we begin this journey across the frozen frontier, I invite you to follow Sio's story to the very end. If her courage moves you, hit that like button and leave your city in the comments so I can see how far her story travels. The train didn't slow for Coldwater Flats so much as it surrendered to it. Siu Wren felt the change in the rails before she saw anything through the frost-clouded window. A reluctant grinding, a loss of momentum, as if even the locomotive had second thoughts about stopping in this particular place. She pressed her cheek against the cold glass and watched the town materialize out of the gray February afternoon, a cluster of wooden buildings arranged without apparent plan along a single main street, the snow piled high against their walls, the sky above them the color of old pewter. She had crossed an ocean for this. The thought arrived without bitterness, which surprised her. She had expected to feel more by now, grief or rage, or at least the particular shame of having been so thoroughly deceived. Arthur Fong had written 17 letters before she'd agreed to come. 17 carefully composed documents full of promises about the mercantile business he'd built, the comfortable house, the respectful partnership he was offering a woman of her education and practical skills. She had read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Arthur Fong had been gone from Coldwater Flats for 3 weeks. He owed money to men who did not wait patiently for repayment. She knew this because the conductor had told her with the particular discomfort of someone delivering news they had no business delivering. He'd heard it in Bismarck. He'd thought she should know before the train stopped. Sio had thanked him. She had continued watching the window. Now the platform appeared, wooden boards silvered with age, and she stood and gathered her bag, one piece of luggage containing everything she'd brought from San Francisco, which was itself everything she'd managed to save or salvage from a life that had been quietly dismantling itself for 2 years. Her father's illness, her mother's retreat into silence, the seamstress work that had kept them eating until it didn't. Arthur Fong's letters arriving like a hand extended through a closing door. She stepped off the train into cold so sharp it felt personal. The platform was nearly empty. A man in a buffalo coat was loading freight onto a wagon at the far end. A woman in practical wool hurried past without looking at Sio. The station master had already retreated into his heated office, visible through the small window as a shadow hunched over a stove. The train groaned and began to move again, and Sio stood very still and let it go. All right, she thought. Here then. She had a small amount of money. She had practical skills, sewing, cooking figures, enough English to navigate most situations, and more than enough stubbornness to navigate the rest. She had survived worse starting positions than this, though at the moment she could not immediately bring one to mind. The cold was genuinely extraordinary. She had been cold before. San Francisco winters were damp and unforgiving, but this was different. A cold with intention, the kind that found the gaps in your clothing and worked through them methodically. Her jacket, which had seemed adequate when she'd packed it, was clearly inadequate. She would need to address this. She was compiling a mental list of immediate priorities. Warmth, shelter, employment when she noticed the man. He was standing at the far end of the platform near the freight wagon, but he wasn't loading anything. He was watching her. When she turned to look directly at him, he looked away with the sudden, elaborate casualness of someone caught doing something they hadn't meant to do. He was tall and lean-built, the way men got from actual physical work, rather than deliberate effort. His coat was worn and practical, his hat pulled against the wind. He looked like someone who spent most of his time outdoors and had stopped thinking much about how he appeared to people indoors. Sio waited. He didn't move. He also didn't leave, which was interesting. After perhaps 2 minutes during which the wind strengthened and Sio's fingers went from cold to numb, the man appeared to make a decision. She watched him straighten slightly, reach some internal threshold, and walk toward her with the deliberate stride of someone who had committed to a course of action and was not going to slow down now for anything. He stopped about 6 feet away. He was holding his hat with both hands in front of him, which she recognized as a gesture of uncertainty rather than greeting. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and careful, like he was choosing each word separately. "I wonder if that is, are you the woman who was coming to marry Arthur Fong?" "I was going to," Sio said. He appears to have made other plans. Something shifted in the man's expression. Not quite a smile, but its precursor. "Yes, ma'am, word got around." He paused. "I'm sorry about that. It's a bad thing to do to anyone." "It is," Sio agreed. "Who are you, Tupan?" "Colt Hadley. I run a cattle ranch about 9 miles out." He glanced down at his hat, then back at her. "I've been standing down there for a while, I suppose, trying to work out whether I had any right to come over here and say what I wanted to say. Siu studied him with more interest. What did you want to say? He met her eyes briefly, then looked at a point just past her shoulder. I have a ranch. It's small, but there's no debt on it. I run about 40 head, and I've got good land with a creek that runs year-round. The house needs work. Well, it always needs work, but it doesn't fall down, and the roof holds in most conditions. He stopped, appeared to recalibrate. What I'm trying to say is that I'm in a position to offer marriage to someone who found themselves in a difficult situation, if that someone were looking for a way out of standing on this platform. Siu regarded him for a long moment. How long were you standing down there, she asked. A pause. Maybe 20 minutes. Before the train arrived. He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. The matchmaker put out a wire, he said, about a woman who'd be stranded. I'd heard it. I thought I'd come see. And then the train came in and you stepped off and He stopped. I'm not good at explaining myself. You saw me get off the train, Siu said, and then you stood down there for 20 minutes working up the courage to come over. He looked uncomfortable. That's about the size of it. Siu had been in difficult situations before. She had learned through sustained experience to read people quickly and to trust the reading. This man was uncomfortable in a way that was consistent with honesty, rather than deception, the specific discomfort of someone who was exposing something true about themselves and didn't particularly enjoy it. Also, her feet were going numb. Is there somewhere warm we could talk? She asked. His relief was visible. Yes, ma'am, there's a cafe across the street. The cafe was small and overheated in the pleasant way of places that had been fighting Dakota winters for years and had learned to commit fully to the effort. A woman behind the counter looked at them with frank curiosity as they took a corner table at Siu first, then at Colt with an expression of mild surprise. Coffee, Nora, Colt said, and whatever's hot. The woman Nora brought coffee and 2 bowls of beef stew without being asked twice. She lingered only a moment before apparent professionalism won out over curiosity. Siu wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and let the warmth work inward. Across the table, Colt sat with his hat on the empty chair beside him, looking at the table rather than at her with the focused attention of a man who had used up his available courage, getting to this point and needed a moment to recover. Tell me about the ranch, Siu said. He looked up. About 300 acres, most of it good grazing. Creek runs year-round, never seen it freeze solid in 7 years. House is 1 main room, sleeping loft, lean-to storage. Barn solid, built it myself 4 years back. He paused. It's isolated, nearest neighbor is nearly 5 miles. Town is 9. In bad weather, that might as well be 100. And you've been alone there. 7 years. He said it plainly without seeking sympathy. I came out with my father's last inheritance and 3 cows and a horse that didn't like me much. Built what I could. He glanced at her. It's a good ranch. I'm proud of it. But there's no one to share it with, and it's a particular kind of empty. Siu considered this. What do you expect from a wife? She asked. She'd asked this question once before of Arthur Fong's letters, and the answers had been elaborate and ultimately false. She wanted to hear how this man answered it, and more importantly, how he didn't. He thought about it, which she appreciated. Work, he said, partnership, someone to help run things and to talk to in the evenings, someone to tell me when I'm wrong about something. A pause. I'd expect honesty, and I'd expect that if you were unhappy, you'd tell me instead of going silent. He looked at the table. Everything else, the other things a marriage includes, only when you were willing. I wouldn't push that. And what would I receive? The ranch is as much yours as mine if you marry me. What's mine is yours, money-land decisions. Equal, say, and he stopped. I won't abandon you. Whatever happens, you won't be alone again. He said the last part quietly without emphasis, which made it land harder than any declaration would have. Siu looked at him, this awkward, careful man who had stood in the February cold for 20 minutes, trying to decide whether he had any right to make an offer, who had told her plainly about the isolation and the hard work and the expectations, who had not once in this conversation tried to impress her with anything except the plain truth of what he had and what he was. She thought about Arthur Fong's 17 letters. I'll tell you who I am, she said, and then I'll give you my answer. She told him about Guangdong province, her father's business, the slow dissolution of a comfortable life into something much harder. She told him about San Francisco, the seamstress work, her mother's particular kind of sorrow that was indistinguishable from surrender. She told him that she was stubborn and that she learned quickly and that she had a sharp tongue when she was tired or frightened and that she believed in honest accounting of things that she would rather know the difficult truth than be protected from it. She did not tell him about the man in San Francisco who had courted her before discovering that her father's disgrace was too complicated for his family's comfort. Some debts of feeling she kept private. "I don't have love to give you," she said at the end. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I don't know you. But I can give you partnership and honesty and real effort." Colt nodded slowly. He had been listening the way certain people listened, with his whole attention without planning his response while she spoke. "That's more than most people start with," he said. "What kind of man are you?" Siu asked. "Not what you do. What kind?" He thought about it for a long time. "The kind who keeps his word," he said finally. "The kind who'd rather lose an argument than tell a lie to win it. The kind who," he paused, and the honesty in his voice became careful, like he was setting something down gently. "The kind who stood in the cold for 20 minutes because he saw a woman step off a train and thought she looked like someone worth knowing, and then spent the next 20 minutes trying to figure out how not to make that strange." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you, today if we can find a pastor. I've made one bad decision already by coming here, I might as well make a better one." She meant it as dark humor. He didn't quite smile, but something in his face eased like a door that had been held shut, finally allowed to rest on its hinges. "There's a church 2 blocks over," he said. "Pastor Crane. He's married people under stranger circumstances." "Then let's go find him." The ceremony was brief and cold. The church's single stove was fighting a losing battle, and witnessed by Nora Britton from the cafe, who had followed them with what she described as professional interest. And what everyone present understood was simple curiosity. Pastor Crane was a weathered man who asked Siu twice if she was certain and accepted her answer of completely without further interrogation. When he pronounced them, husband and wife, Colt's "I do" had been quiet but solid, the kind of thing said once and meant for a long time. Outside, Nora gripped Siu's arm with unexpected warmth. "He's a good man," she said low enough that Colt wouldn't hear. "Quiet and strange in his ways, but good down to the bone. Most people in this town would agree on that." "Most people?" Siu asked. Nora's expression shifted slightly. "Most." Siu noticed the qualification but filed it away for later. There was a wagon to get to and 9 miles of February to cover. The ride out of town was long and bitterly cold, but Colt had thought to bring an extra blanket, which Siu pulled around her shoulders without ceremony while he drove. He spoke about the cattle in the same way she imagined some people spoke about their children, with the particular precision of someone who knew each animal individually and thought the details were worth conveying. She listened and learned what she could, which was considerable. She had always been good at learning. "There's something else about the town," Colt said after a while, his eyes on the road. "Something you should probably know." Siu waited. "There's a man who owns the bank, Wallace Creed." His voice had changed, slightly flattened. "He's been there. Is history there. It's not a friendly history." "What kind, Bars?" "I'll tell you when we're settled in," he said. "It's a long story, and I want to tell it right." Siu accepted this. She had married a stranger today. A long story told properly seemed like a reasonable request. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road, settled in a shallow valley where the trees provided some shelter from the wind. It was smaller than she'd imagined and more solidly built than she'd expected, the fence lines straight, the wood pile carefully stacked, the barn large enough to suggest real investment. Everything about it said someone made decisions here with the intention of staying. Colt helped her down from the wagon and stood looking at the place with the self-conscious expression of someone presenting something they've worked on for years and are not sure will be received well. "It's more than I had yesterday," Siu said. He exhaled. "I'll get a fire started." That first evening, they moved around each other with the careful courtesy of strangers sharing close quarters, which was exactly what they were. Siu found the kitchen and made something from what was available: salt pork, dried beans, cornbread from the last of the flour, and Colt ate with the unguarded appreciation of a man who had been cooking for himself for 7 years and was not too proud to admit that someone else did it better. After supper, he said, "I should tell you about Creed." He told her. His voice was level throughout the way it got. She was beginning to understand when he was controlling something he felt strongly. 8 years ago, Colt had been a hired hand on a neighboring ranch when the owner's brother, a man named Daniel Creed, had come through the territory running a land scheme, buying parcels cheaply from families in difficulty and reselling to railroad interests at significant profit. The families hadn't understood what they were signing. Colt had understood because he'd seen the documents and knew how to read them. He testified to the Territorial Land Office. Daniel Creed had been barred from operating in the territory and had died of fever 2 years later. Wallace Creed had become a banker. He had never forgotten. "He hasn't done anything," Colt said. "Not yet. He holds no debt on this land. I made sure of that, paid cash for what I could, and took no loans I couldn't clear in a single year. But he looks at me in a way that I don't like, and I've heard things." He paused. "I wanted you to know the landscape you were walking into." Siu sat with this information for a moment. "Why did you tell me tonight?" she asked. "You could have waited weeks." "Because you asked me what kind of man I was," Colt said. "I told you I don't lie to win arguments. That means telling you the things that are inconvenient as well as the things that aren't." Siu looked at him across the table, this quiet, careful man who had stood in the cold for 20 minutes and then told her about his enemies on the first night. "Thank you," she said. They climbed to the sleeping loft by lamplight, and Colt lay on his side of the bed with the deliberate stillness of someone maintaining a promise without making a production of it, and Siu listened to the wind find the gaps in the cabin walls and thought, all right, here then. This then. She had gambled everything on this journey. She was beginning to believe the gamble might have been worth it. Outside, the Dakota winter pressed against the windows, indifferent and enormous. And in the morning, there would be work to learn and a life to build from nothing. And somehow that felt less frightening than it had 24 hours ago, when she'd been standing alone on a frozen platform, watching the last train pull away. She slept. The first week passed in the way that genuinely hard work tends to pass too fast during daylight, too slow in the muscles afterward. Siu learned the ranch in layers. First layer, the animals. 2 draft horses named Bishop and Rook, which Colt had named without irony because he'd been playing chess against himself that winter and was running out of things to name. A riding horse called Gray, who was patient about Siu's early attempts at mounting and then progressively less patient as he concluded she was capable of doing better. 40 head of cattle spread across winter range, each with individual personalities that Colt described with the same straight-faced precision he brought to everything. Second layer, the work. She had understood intellectually that ranch work was physical. Understanding and doing were different propositions. By the third morning, her hands had blisters on the blisters, her back ached in ways that suggested muscles she hadn't known she possessed, and she had developed a deep personal respect for the weight of a hay bale. She didn't mention any of this. She had promised partnership. Partnership was not selective. Third layer, Colt himself. He was methodical rather than methodical, a distinction she was still working out. He didn't follow routines because they were routines, but because he had thought carefully about the most efficient way to do things and then done them that way until a better way presented itself. He explained things once clearly and then trusted her to remember. When she got something wrong, he corrected it without drama. When she got something right, he said so in the same tone he used for everything else, which was quiet and precise. She was beginning to understand that this was his form of compliment. He said what he meant what he said. The economy of it was something she respected. On the 4th day, he took her to town for proper winter clothes. The general store was run by a thin, watchful man named Morrison, who looked at Siu with a particular expression of someone performing a rapid calculation and not being certain he liked the result. "Getting your wife outfitted, Hadley," he said. "That's the idea," Colt said. Morrison's eyes moved to Siu and back. "Didn't know you'd gotten married. Happened last week." Colt was examining a pair of lined gloves with professional interest. "Do you have these in smaller sizes?" The transaction proceeded without incident, which Siu noticed was a result of Colt's refusal to engage with anything that wasn't directly relevant to the business at hand. As they left, she said, "He didn't approve." "Morrison doesn't approve of most things," Colt said, loading the packages into the wagon. "He'll get over it or he won't. Either way, you needed proper gloves." On the way back, they passed the bank. It was the most substantial building on the main street, brick rather than wood, with glass windows and a painted sign. A man stood in the doorway, heavy-set in a coat that was too fine for the weather, watching the street, with the proprietary air of someone surveying territory they consider their own. He saw Colt. Something crossed his face, controlled, quickly smoothed over. Colt kept his eyes on the road. "That was Creed," Siu said. "Yes." She looked back at the man in the doorway. He was still watching them. She held his gaze until the wagon turned a corner and he disappeared. She began to understand in that moment that the landscape Colt had warned her about was not theoretical. On the sixth day, late in the afternoon, when the light was going orange and thin and the day's work was winding down, Siu found something. She was in the storage lean-to, reorganizing the shelves to a system that made more sense to her than the one currently in place, when she found a tin box at the back of the top shelf behind 3 years of accumulated miscellany. She brought it down, meaning to dust it off, and put it back, and the lid came open. Inside was a stack of papers, and at the top, a contract. She had been a seamstress. She had managed her father's accounts when his hands got bad. She knew how to read a document. She sat on the floor of the lean-to and read it carefully twice in the failing light. It was a property transfer agreement, 3 years old, predating Colt by the property's previous owner. The lot numbers were adjacent to the ranch's current boundaries, a parcel Colt had mentioned wanting to eventually acquire for expanded grazing. The contract had been declared void on a technicality, with a handwritten note at the bottom that she didn't fully understand, but the signature at the bottom of the page was W. Creed. This was interesting. She put the contract back and finished reorganizing the shelves. That evening over supper, she said, "Tell me about the property to the north, the parcel you mentioned." Colt looked up. "What about it? Who owned it before it was voided?" A pause. "Old man Patterson. He died 4 years ago before I came. No heirs. Contract got complicated. Why?" "I found a document in the lean-to," Siu said. "A transfer agreement. 3 years old. Creed's name is on it." Colt set down his fork. She told him what she'd read. He listened with that complete attention she'd come to recognize, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Patterson had no heirs," he said slowly. "The land should have reverted to open territory. But if Creed had a transfer agreement in place, the land might not be as open as you think," Siu said, "or he might be planning to claim it." They looked at each other across the table. "It might be nothing," Colt said finally. "It might be," Siu agreed. Neither of them believed it. That night she lay awake for a long time, thinking about the contract, about the signature at the bottom of the page, about Creed standing in the doorway of his bank, watching them drive past with the patient expression of someone who has decided they can afford to wait. She was beginning to understand what kind of problem this might become. In the morning, she thought, in the morning we plan. Outside, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees and the stars over the Dakota prairie were extraordinarily bright. And Siu Wren Hadley, married 1 week to a stranger who was becoming less strange every day, closed her eyes and began thinking through what they knew and what they needed to find out and what she was going to do about it. She had always been better at problems than at waiting. The second week brought snow that came in sideways and a sick cow that required 2 nights of close attention before she recovered, and through all of it, Siu watched and listened and filed things away. She watched the way Colt moved through difficult situations with the same steadiness he brought to everything problem-solving, rather than catastrophizing, breaking things down to what could be done right now and what needed to wait. She found this quality genuinely valuable and said so. "My father panicked," she told him one evening while they were monitoring the sick cow in the barn, sitting on hay bales with lanterns between them. "When things went wrong, he got louder and faster and started making decisions before he understood the problem. I always thought if you could just slow down enough to see what was actually happening." "Panic's expensive," Colt agreed. He was checking the cow's breathing again, a hand on her flank. "You can't afford it on a ranch. Animal knows when you're scared. Spooks them, makes everything worse." "That's true with people too," Siu said. He looked at her sideways. "Yeah." "Your father," she asked. She'd mentioned hers. "Fair exchange. Left when I was 12, Colt said. "Not dead, just left. Sent money sometimes. What I mean is I don't have a comparison point. I learned things from the ranchers I worked for. Some of them good, some of them less so." "What was the best thing you learned?" He considered this for a genuine while. "That most problems are solved by showing up the next day," he said finally. Whatever happens today, the sick cow, the broken fence, the money that's short, most of it looks different after a night and a morning. Not better necessarily, but clearer. You can see the edges of it. Siu thought about standing on the train platform, the cold, the disappearing certainty of a plan she'd spent months building. That's true, she said. The cow improved by morning. They went back to the house and slept 3 hours, and then got up and did the work. In the second week, Siu also began to understand the community she'd married into. Nora Britton came out on a Thursday with bread and a barely concealed desire to understand who Colt Hadley had managed to acquire as a wife, and under what circumstances. She was sharp-eyed and warm in equal measure, the kind of woman who collected information the way other people collected debts and deployed it with more purpose. "You're not what I expected," Nora said, watching Siu work through the kitchen organization. "What did you expect? Someone quieter, probably. More uncertain." She paused. Colt doesn't talk to many people. He needed someone who wouldn't let him disappear into the work completely. Has he done that before? Every winter. Nora said it without judgment, just information. Works himself to exhaustion and then rattles around that house for 3 months trying to figure out what he's working toward. Better last month, though. He's been, she paused, different since you came. Steadier. Siu absorbed this without comment. "Tell me about Creed," she said. Nora's expression shifted. "What specifically, whatever you know that I should?" What Nora knew was considerable. Wallace Creed had come to Coldwater Flats 6 years ago after his brother's disgrace and built a banking operation that everyone understood was legitimate, and that everyone also understood had edges that weren't quite visible. He held mortgages on 7 properties in the valley. 3 of those properties had been foreclosed in the past 4 years. Each time the circumstances had been just inside the law. "He picks people who don't have resources to fight back," Nora said. "People who are isolated or who don't understand the documents they've signed or who have problems they're trying not to tell anyone about. He waits until the moment when they're weakest, and then he moves." "He's been waiting for Colt," Siu said. "For 8 years. Nora's voice was flat. "Colt's ranch has no debt for him to call, so whatever he's planning, it's something else." That evening, Siu sat at the kitchen table with the document from the lean-to and thought about Wallace Creed, who had waited 8 years for the right angle of attack. She thought about the property to the north. She thought about the way he'd watched their wagon from the doorway of his bank. She was beginning to formulate a theory. She needed more information to confirm it. In the morning, she thought, but when morning came, it brought Wallace Creed himself. He arrived in a black buggy too fine for ranch roads, driven with the careful movements of someone who considered himself above physical effort. He climbed down in the yard and stood looking at the property with that proprietary expression Siu had seen from the wagon, and when Colt emerged from the barn, Creed smiled with his mouth only. "Hadley," he said, "I heard you'd gotten married. Wanted to offer my congratulations in person." "You could have sent a letter," Colt said, "and missed the opportunity to meet your new wife." Creed's eyes moved to Siu, who had come out onto the porch. His gaze was measuring the kind of assessment that was not about attraction, but about leverage. "Charmed," he said in a tone that meant nothing of the sort. "Mr. Creed," Siu said. "Mrs. Hadley." He turned back to Colt. "Actually, I did have some business to discuss. There's a matter of the Patterson parcel, the land to the north of your property." Siu went very still. "What about it?" Colt said. "I've been doing some research." Creed reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Turns out old Patterson owed a debt to my bank, a personal loan paid in cash, with a lien on that property as collateral. I've been unable to locate the documentation until recently." He held out the paper. "I'm claiming the parcel. Legal transfer should be complete within 60 days. Colt took the document. His face was neutral in the way that Siu was learning meant he was thinking fast behind a still surface. "I'll need to have this reviewed," he said. "Of course," Creed said pleasantly. "Take all the time you need. The legal fact of it won't change." He paused. "There's also the matter of access. That parcel sits between your ranch and the creek to the north. Once I hold the title, you'll need my permission for your cattle to reach that water source." The implications landed like stones into still water. No northern creek access meant their winter range was compromised. Compromised range meant insufficient grazing. Insufficient grazing meant reducing the herd. Reducing the herd meant everything unraveling slowly and deliberately just inside the law. "Clever," Siu said. Creed looked at her with what might have been surprise. You've been waiting for an angle, she said. There's no debt to call on this property, so you're trying to close off the resources instead. Control the water, control the ranch. She kept her voice pleasant. It's a reasonable strategy. I'm curious what you're planning to do with 40 head of cattle in a creek, though. You don't strike me as a man who wants to run livestock. Something tightened behind Creed's eyes. The railroad, Colt said very quietly. Siu saw it at the same moment. You're not after the cattle land. You're after the right-of-way. If you control that northern parcel, you control whether the rail line goes through this valley or around it. A silence stretched across the frozen yard. Creed's smile had not moved, but his eyes were different now, colder, more calculating. You married a quick woman, Hadley, he said. That can be inconvenient. Or useful, Siu said, depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. Creed tipped his hat. 60 days, he said. I'd think carefully about your options. He climbed back into his buggy and drove away, and Siu and Colt stood in the yard watching him go. You saw it faster than I did, Colt said. I had time to think about it. She turned to him. We need to know if that lien is real. How? Siu looked at the document in his hands. I'm going to start by reading this very carefully, she said. And then we're going to go find out everything we can about Patterson's debts, Creed's banking records, and what actually happened to that land before we ever got here. She took the document from him and went inside. This, she thought, is the problem. Now, what do we do about it? She had always been better at problems than at waiting. She read the lien document 4 times. She read it at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up high, and she read it with the particular attention she'd developed doing her father's accounts, looking not just at what was said, but at what the saying implied, the gaps between statements, the language chosen when other language might have served as well. The document was professionally prepared. The language was correct. The lien amount was plausible. Patterson's signature was there, witnessed and dated. But the date was February 12, 1883. Siu had been in Coldwater Flats for 2 weeks. She had been asking questions, learning the shape of the community, filing away information. In 2 weeks, she had learned, among other things, that old man Patterson had died of consumption in the winter of 1882. February 12, 1883, was 3 months after Patterson was in the ground. She set down the document and sat very still. Colt was at the table with her, pretending to read a farming almanac. She could see from the way he wasn't turning pages that he was actually waiting. The date is wrong, she said. He looked up. Patterson died in November 1882, she said. This document is dated February 1883. Either Creed's records are mistaken or someone signed this after Patterson was dead. Colt stared at the date. I knew Patterson was gone before I came out here. I heard about it in Bismarck when I was looking at land. Everyone knew he'd died that winter. Which means Creed either made an error or he forged this. Siu paused. How difficult would it be to prove the date of Patterson's death? Church records, Colt said immediately. Pastor Crane would have it. Burial records. And there's a land office in Bismarck with territorial records. They'd have the death registered because of the property question. Can we get to Bismarck? In this weather, 3 days there and back. Minimum. He was looking at the document now with the expression she'd come to recognize as controlled fury. He knew. He knows we'd figure this out given time, which means the 60 days isn't just about the railroad. He's betting we can't get to Bismarck and back with proof before he files the transfer. Then we get the church records first, Siu said. Pastor Crane, tomorrow. And in the meantime, she folded the document and put it in the tin box from the lean-to which she'd brought inside. In the meantime, we don't let him know we found the problem. If he thinks we're focused on the railroad question, he won't be looking for us to challenge the document itself. Colt regarded her for a moment. You've done this before, he said. Done what? Figured out where the real problem is when someone's showing you a different problem. Siu thought about her father's accounts, about the suppliers who had claimed payment, while the ledgers said otherwise, the slow realization that things were not as reported. Yes, she said, though usually with less at stake. They rode into town the next morning. Pastor Crane was a careful man who kept meticulous records. He found Patterson's burial entry within minutes, November 14, 1882, of consumption alone, no family present. He read the date on the lien document with the expression of someone who had seen human dishonesty before but still found it distasteful. I can't testify to the forgery, he said carefully, but I can certify that Mr. Patterson was in this churchyard by November 1882. That's enough, Siu said. Can you write that out dated and signed? Of course, he looked at Colt. How much trouble are you in Hadley? Some, Colt said. Working on it. On their way out of the church, they encountered Nora Britton, who had the quality of appearing wherever information was being generated. You look like people who found something, she said. Colt glanced at Siu. She nodded slightly. We think Creed forged a lien document, Siu said. The signature is dated after Patterson was dead. Nora was silent for a beat that was shorter than it looked. Then we need to talk, she said. Come to the cafe. There's someone I want you to meet. The someone was a young woman named Delia Marsh, who was sitting in the back corner of the cafe with her hands around a cup of coffee and the posture of someone who expected to need to leave quickly. She was perhaps 23 with dark circles under her eyes and clothing that was clean but worn in a particular way, not poverty exactly, but the kind of careful management that came from having had more once. Delia used to work at Creed's bank, Nora said quietly before they sat down. Siu looked at Delia Marsh with new attention. I know why you're here, Delia said when they'd settled. Her voice was controlled in the same way that Colt's was controlled, something held back carefully. Creed's going after the Hadley Ranch. You know about it, Colt said. I know about most of what Creed does. She paused. I worked for him for 2 years. I left 6 months ago. Why, Siu asked. Delia Marsh set down her coffee cup. Because I'm his accountant's daughter, she said. My father worked for Creed for 10 years. 8 years ago, Creed used my father's signature on documents he shouldn't have authorization for transactions that weren't authorized that made it look like my father was embezzling. My father lost everything defending himself. He died 2 years later. She said it with the flatness of someone who has carried grief so long it's become structural. I worked for Creed because I needed to understand what he'd done. And because my younger brother, he's 11, Creed took him in, called it charity. Her voice went very careful. Tommy lives in Creed's house. She understood immediately. Not charity, she said. Insurance? Delia agreed. If I cause trouble, Tommy is vulnerable. He's too young to understand. He just thinks Mr. Creed is kind. The table was quiet. What do you know about the Patterson lien? Siu asked. I prepared the document, Delia said. Another silence. Creed told me it was a legitimate debt, she said, and the weight in her voice was self-recrimination she'd clearly carried for months. He said Patterson had borrowed against the property informally, no paperwork, and he needed me to formalize it. He gave me the date. I didn't, she stopped. I should have questioned it. I didn't. You didn't know Patterson was dead when the date was written, Siu said. It wasn't quite a question. I found out afterward. Delia's hands had tightened around her cup. That was when I left. You kept records, Colt said. Not a question either. Delia reached into her coat and removed a folded piece of paper. A copy of the instructions I was given, in Creed's handwriting. She set it on the table. The date in his hand, before I wrote the document. Colt reached for it. Siu got there, first opened it, read it carefully. The date was in Creed's handwriting. The instructions were clear. The paper was the smoking gun they'd needed, and Delia Marsh had been carrying it for 6 months. Why didn't you take this to the authorities? Siu asked. Tommy, Delia said simply. Siu looked at her for a long moment. If we can get Tommy safe, she said slowly, would you be willing to testify? Something moved in Delia Marsh's face, relief and terror in equal measure. Yes, she said. God help me, yes. They rode back to the ranch in silence for a while, the document in Siu's coat, the cold pressing in around them. He used her father's reputation against her, Colt said finally, and now he's using her brother. He finds the pressure points, Siu agreed. Your testimony against his brother 8 years ago. Delia's love for Tommy now. He doesn't fight directly, he finds what people care about and puts pressure there. Which means, Colt started, which means what he's going to use against us isn't obvious, Siu said. It's not the land or the cattle. It's something else. Something we care about. They looked at each other. The ranch, Colt said. We've known that. No, he said. I mean you. He'll go after you. You're the thing I care about that I didn't care about before. Siu processed this. It was the most direct declaration he'd made. He'd said it the way he said most important things, matter-of-factly, as if the fact were established and he was simply reporting it. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to stop. I didn't think you would." A pause. "I just wanted you to know that I—" He stopped. "What I said about caring about you, that's true." She looked at the road ahead, at the bleak February landscape, at the tracks in the snow from their wagon, and the way they stretched back toward the town where Wallace Creed was presumably planning his next move. "I know that too," she said. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. That evening, Creed came. Not in person this time, by letter delivered by a boy from town who handed it over without meeting anyone's eyes and left quickly. Siu read it, standing in the doorway, the cold coming in around her. The letter was brief and pleasant in the way that threats from controlled men are pleasant. It noted that Creed understood they had been asking questions around town. It expressed his confidence that they would find the property transfer entirely in order. It wished them well. At the bottom, in different ink, added later an afterthought that wasn't, "I hope your new wife is finding the territory agreeable. It can be difficult for newcomers, especially those without connections or resources of their own." Siu showed Colt the letter. He read it twice. His face did not change. "He's telling us he can make you disappear," Colt said. "If you're not here, I have less reason to fight." "He's telling us he's paying attention," Siu said, "and that he's confident." She folded the letter carefully. "Confident men make assumptions. Assumptions are where you find errors." "What kind of assumptions?" "That I came here with nothing," Siu said. "That I have no resources and no connections." She was quiet for a moment. "He's right that I don't have many connections in this territory, but I know people in San Francisco. I know a lawyer there, a friend of my father's from before the bad years. He knows banking law." Colt looked at her. "I'm going to write to him tonight," she said. "I want his opinion on the lien document and on the forged date before we take this to any local authority." "Why not local?" "Because Creed's been here 6 years and I've been here 2 weeks," Siu said. "I don't know which local authorities he's got relationships with. I want someone outside his reach to look at this first." Colt was quiet for a moment. "You think about this differently than I do," he said. "You think about it in terms of fighting," she said. "I think about it in terms of information. What I know, what he knows, what neither of us knows yet. That's useful." "I hope so." She went to the table and found paper. "In the meantime, tell me everything you know about the night Patterson died. Who was there, who knew about the property, who Creed was speaking with in the months before." Colt sat down across from her and began to talk, and Siu wrote, and outside the temperature dropped, and the stars came out hard and bright over the Dakota prairie, and in the cabin, 2 people who had married for practical reasons were becoming something more complicated than practical. Neither of them said so. Neither of them needed to. 3 weeks passed. The letter went to San Francisco. The ranch work continued in its relentless way. Siu learned to read land surveys and discovered she had a talent for it, the same spatial reasoning she'd used for pattern cutting, translated unexpectedly to topographical maps. Colt noticed and gave her more to read without making it a lesson. The days had found a shape. Morning animals. Midday, the 100 small repairs and tasks of winter. Evening planning or talking, or the comfortable silence they'd both stopped needing to fill. She noticed the way he watched her when she was working, not with possession, but with something quieter than that attention that was also care, the way you watch something you've decided matters. She did not comment on it. She watched him too, in the same way. On a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into their investigation, sitting at the kitchen table with the survey maps and the Patterson records, and Delia Marsh's written statement spread between them, Colt said, "There's something I should have told you sooner." Siu looked up. "The testimony against Creed's brother," he said. "It wasn't just because it was the right thing. I mean, it was right, but I was also angry." He looked at the table. "The family those land schemes hurt, one of them was an older couple who'd been on that land for 30 years. The wife died 2 months after they lost the property. And he stopped. "I'd been working for them when it happened. She reminded me of my mother, not in any specific way, just the particular way she was stubborn about things mattering." Siu was quiet, letting him continue. "So when I testified, I was right, but I was also angry, and I've been carrying some of that ever since." He raised his eyes to hers. I want you to know that about me, that I'm capable of righteous anger that doesn't fully account for consequences. Because if we're going to be all going into this fight together, you should know the parts of me that might complicate it. The honesty of it was almost uncomfortable. Siu thought about what it cost someone like Colt Private Economical to say something like that unprompted. What you're telling me, she said slowly, is that you're human. I'm telling you there are things that make me unreliable. Everyone has those, Siu said. The question is whether you know about them. She paused. I'm stubborn to the point of stupidity sometimes. When I've decided on a course of action, I don't reconsider easily even when I should. That's my version of what you're describing. He looked at her. We make a strange pair, she said. Yes, he agreed, and something in the word held more warmth than it had room to technically contain. The response from San Francisco arrived on a Thursday 40 days after the letter was sent. It was from the lawyer, a man named Gerald Fong, no relation to Arthur, which Siu found grimly fitting, and it was thorough and definitive. The lien Gerald Fong wrote was fraudulent on multiple grounds. The signature issue was the simplest, but there were also structural problems with the document itself, clauses that had not been in use in 1883 legal language that had come into common practice in 1885. Whoever had prepared the document had made errors that a good lawyer would find immediately. It would not survive challenge. He had also, on her request, researched Wallace Creed's background. What he'd found was detailed and useful. Before coming to Dakota territory, Creed had operated a banking firm in Minnesota that had been investigated twice for fraudulent practices. Both investigations had been dropped when key witnesses recanted. Gerald Fong had noted the specific word recanted with the careful phrasing of a man who believed the recantations had not been voluntary. Creed had left Minnesota with his reputation technically intact and all his money. He's done this before, Colt said, reading over her shoulder. Many times. Siu folded the letter. The question now is whether we go to the territorial authorities directly or whether we prepare more carefully first. If we go too early and he knows we're moving, he still has Tommy Marsh, Siu said. That's the piece we haven't solved. She had been thinking about Tommy Marsh for weeks. The boy was 11, living in Creed's house, not understanding that he was leverage. Getting him out safely required either an authority willing to act on the information they had or finding a reason for Creed to release him voluntarily. What if Creed didn't need him anymore? Colt said. Siu turned. What do you mean? The thing he's using Tommy for is to keep Delia silent. If Delia's already testified, if her statement is already in front of a judge, Tommy becomes useless to him. He can't untestify her. Siu sat very still, thinking through the sequence. We get her statement formally submitted first, she said, before he knows we're moving. Once it's on record, what happens to Tommy doesn't change what she's already said. Does she know that? I don't know. We need to talk to her. They rode to town the next morning. Nora Britton helped arrange the meeting quickly and without unnecessary questions. She had the qualities Siu was coming to appreciate of someone who understood when not to ask for explanations. Delia Marsh looked at them in the back corner of the cafe with the permanent wariness of someone who had been holding themselves too tightly for too long. We have a letter from a lawyer in San Francisco, Siu said. She laid out what Gerald Fong had written and Pastor Crane's certification of the death date and her own reading of the structural errors in the lien. If we submit your statement before Creed knows we're moving, it becomes a matter of record. After that, whatever happens to Tommy, it doesn't change your testimony. You've already given it. Delia Marsh's eyes were very bright. He'll know it was me, she said. Yes, Siu said. I won't pretend he won't. What happens to Tommy? We make sure a judge knows Tommy is in Creed's house before we move, Colt said. That he's there as leverage on you. A judge who's been told a child is being used as collateral will act on it. Do you trust the judge? We don't know who the circuit judge will be, Siu said honestly. We're gambling on the system working the way it's supposed to. Delia Marsh looked at her for a long moment. That's not much to bet on, she said. No, Siu agreed, but it's what we have. Another silence. When Delia asked, we ride to the territorial capital next week, Siu said. All three of us, if you're willing. We file with the territorial land office and the banking commissioner at the same time. 2 jurisdictions. Harder to suppress. Delia unfolded her hands from around her coffee cup. All right, she said. Yes. They rode home in the late afternoon, the sky turning colors behind them, and Colt said, "If this goes wrong, it might," Siu said. "If it does, I want you to know that I don't." He stopped. "I made a life here alone, and it was fine. But this, what we've built in 8 weeks, I couldn't go back to fine." Siu looked at the road ahead. "Neither could I," she said. They were quiet the rest of the way back, and the thing that had been building between them without announcement or permission went on building quietly and steadily, the way things do when they're real. That night, Siu lay awake for a while, listening to Colt breathe on the other side of the mattress, steady, already asleep, and thought about 8 weeks. 8 weeks ago, she'd been standing on a train platform with nowhere to go. 8 weeks ago, this man had been a stranger holding wilted flowers in a practiced speech. They had not yet said the word love to each other. They didn't need to. It was already there in the way he listened when she spoke, in the way she thought without having to think about it, in the weight of his hand on her shoulder, when she was tired, in the fact that when she listed the things she was afraid of losing, he was at the top of the list. She closed her eyes. In a week, she thought, one more week and we move. Outside the window, the prairie was brilliant with moonlight on snow, and somewhere in the valley, a coyote was calling into the cold. And Siu Wren Hadley, 8 weeks married and more certain by the day, slept. But the week did not go as planned. On Sunday evening, 2 days before they were supposed to ride for the capital, Colt went to the barn to check on Bishop and Rook and did not come back. She waited 15 minutes before going after him. She found him in the barn, standing very still in the center of the space, something in his hands, staring at it. It was a document, different paper from the lean, newer crisper. She could see from the doorway that it had been left on the hay bale nearest the barn door. She took it from him and read it. The document was a mortgage. It was dated the previous month. Colt's signature was at the bottom. Colt had taken out a loan from Creed's bank for $1,500, mortgaging the ranch property as collateral. The signature looked right. "I never signed this," Colt said. His voice was dangerously level. "I have never borrowed money from Creed's bank. I have never had a conversation with anyone from Creed's bank about a loan." She read it again. The signature was a close imitation. Not perfect, she could see, now that she was looking for it, a slight difference in the way the letters of the first name connected. "He's escalating," she said. "He found out we've been asking questions." Colt turned away, one hand on a stall post, his back to her. "This is forgery, an outright forgery. He's not even being subtle." "He's not being subtle because he doesn't need to be subtle yet," Siu said. "He'll present this to us first, give us a chance to pay or capitulate. When we refuse, he'll file foreclosure. By the time it gets to a judge, it'll look like a complicated dispute between us and the bank. If we were going to the Capitol Tuesday, he'll have this in front of a local judge before we get back." "Yes," Siu thought fast, "unless we go today." Colt turned. "What?" "If we leave tonight, we're in the Capitol by Wednesday morning. We file before he files. Once our documentation is on record with the territorial offices, the lien fraud Delia's statement, Gerald Fong's analysis, his mortgage forgery, is another document in a pattern of fraud rather than a standalone dispute." She was already moving back toward the cabin. "He doesn't expect us to move this fast. He thinks we'll try to confront him first. He thinks we'll make a mistake." "What about Delia?" "We stop at Nora's on the way out of town and tell her to send word to Delia. She knows what to do." Siu was through the barn door, crossing the yard in the cold. "Pack for 3 days. We leave in an hour." Colt stared after her for half a second, then he started moving. They left in the dark, the horse's breath making clouds against the stars. They stopped at Nora's for 20 minutes, long enough for Siu to explain, for Nora's eyes to sharpen with understanding, for Nora to say, "I'll handle it," in the voice of someone who had been waiting for a task worthy of their abilities. Then the road opened before them, dark and cold and long, and they rode into it. The Capitol was 3 days' ride in good weather. In February, with the roads uncertain and the temperature dropping at night to something that required them to keep moving to stay warm, it was closer to 4. They talked through the hours, planning, reviewing, preparing for what they'd say, and what documentation they'd present, and what order to approach the offices. But they also talked about other things, the way people talk when they're covering miles together in the dark, when the cold makes conversation feel necessary for warmth. Colt told her about the ranch he'd worked on at 17, and the couple who'd run it, and the woman who'd reminded him of his mother. He told it better this time, with more of the actual feeling in it. Siu told him about the man in San Francisco. She hadn't meant to, but she did: the courtship, the family's discovery, the feeling of being reduced to her father's mistake rather than seen as herself. She told him how she'd stood in the laundry afterward for 6 months before Arthur Fong's letters arrived, and how she'd read them the way she'd read the lien document, looking for what was said and what wasn't. You read the letters and you knew they weren't honest, Colt said. I suspected. I chose to hope anyway. She paused. I was desperate, and hope is expensive, and I paid for it. Was I hope too, he asked. On the platform. You were the only other option, she said. But then you told me about the ranch leaking in the hard winters. You told me what you couldn't do well. Nobody who's lying about what they're offering lists their deficits first. So I was hope because I was honest. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. They rode for a while in silence. I'm glad you said yes, Colt said. So am I, Siu said. Even now, especially now. They reached the capital on the fourth morning, road-worn and cold, and carrying a folder of documentation that represented everything they'd spent 8 weeks assembling. The territorial offices were housed in a single building on the main street, land office on one side, banking commissioner on the other. They filed simultaneously. 2 offices, the same documentation at 9 o'clock in the morning. The banking commissioner's deputy, a thin young man named Walsh, read Gerald Fong's letter and Delia's statement in the pastor's certification of Patterson's death and the instruction note in Creed's handwriting. He read them in the careful way of someone who understood what he was looking at. When was this second document presented to you? He asked about the forged mortgage. 5 days ago, Colt said. Walsh looked at his colleague, and something passed between them that Siu couldn't read clearly. This isn't the first inquiry we've received about Mr. Creed, Walsh said. He could not, he explained, tell them specifics of other investigations, but he could tell them that their documentation would be reviewed as a matter of priority and that an investigator would be dispatched to Coldwater Flats within 2 weeks. We have a deadline, Siu said. The forged mortgage, he'll file foreclosure. I understand, Walsh's voice was careful. I can issue a hold on any foreclosure actions from Creed's institution pending investigation. That's within my authority. He made a note. You'll have it in writing before you leave today. Siu sat back in her chair. The hold, the documentation on record, the investigation in progress. Not victory, but footing. She caught Colt's eye across the table. He looked the way she felt, cautiously, carefully, not wanting to name it yet, but something. They rode home with the written hold in Siu's coat pocket and the winter closing in around them. And somewhere on the second day of the return journey, when they'd been riding in companionable silence for an hour, Colt said, Thank you. Siu turned. For thinking faster than I did, he said. For knowing to leave that night. I'd have confronted him first. It would have been a mistake. You would have figured it out, she said. Maybe, but not in time. He kept his eyes on the road. You have a particular way of seeing things, the shape of them before everyone else sees the shape. Siu thought about this. My father taught me to read accounts, she said. He said every set of numbers tells a story, and your job is to figure out what story it's actually telling versus what someone wants you to think it's telling. Same with people, Colt said. Same with people, she agreed. They rode on, and the cold was considerable and the road was long, but neither of them minded very much. They came home to a changed situation. Nora met them at the edge of town with news delivered in her characteristic efficient style, facts first, context after. Creed had filed the foreclosure on the forged mortgage 4 days after they'd left. He'd filed it with a local judge named Perkins, whom Siu now added to her mental list of relationships Creed had cultivated over 6 years. Judge Perkins had signed the notice. Creed had then ridden to the ranch personally to affix the notice to the door. The good news, the banking commissioner's hold had arrived by telegraph the following day. Perkins, faced with a territorial override, had suspended the proceedings. The bad news, Creed knew they'd gone to the Capitol. He knew they'd filed, and he was not the kind of man who responded to setbacks by retreating. Tommy, Siu said immediately. Delia moved fast, Nora said. She went to the schoolmaster the day after you left, told him everything. The schoolmaster went to the circuit judge who was passing through. The judge ordered Tommy removed from Creed's house pending investigation. He's staying with the schoolmaster's family now. Siu exhaled. Delia, Colt asked. Staying at my place, Nora said. She's scared, but she's holding together. She wants to testify. They rode out to the ranch and found the foreclosure notice still on the door. Colt pulled it down without ceremony and fed it into the stove. That evening, for the first time in weeks, they sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table with nothing specific to plan. The immediate crisis had been forestalled. The investigation was underway. There were no documents to analyze, no letters to write, no next steps that couldn't wait until morning. The silence was full of everything that had been set aside while they were busy. Outside, it had begun to rain, a cold February rain that came in sideways off the prairie and rattled the windows. "Come sit on the porch," Siu said. Colt looked up from the almanac he wasn't reading. "It's raining. There's an overhang." He came. They sat on the porch steps under the overhang with the rain coming down 3 feet in front of them, drumming on the frozen ground and the lamps in the cabin, casting amber light through the window behind them. Siu had her small journal on her knee. She'd been carrying it since San Francisco, writing things down when they needed to exist somewhere outside her own head. "What are you writing?" Colt asked. "Characters," she said, "for the Chinese." She turned the journal toward him. The page showed a single character, large and careful. "This is your name." The sound of it, Colt doesn't exist directly in Chinese, but I chose this character because it means something close. He leaned toward the journal. "What does it mean?" "Something like steady against wind." She traced the lines with her finger. "The shape of it is a tree with deep roots." Colt looked at the character for a long time. "Show me how to write it." She handed him the pencil. She guided his hand through the strokes. The order mattered. She explained the direction of each line. He was careful with it the way he was careful with delicate things, which was at odds with how much physical force he spent most of his time deploying. After 3 attempts, he had something passable. "Now yours," he said, handing back the pencil. She wrote it 2 characters, her name. "The first means little or young," she said. "The second means wren, a small bird." She paused. "My father chose it. He said wrens were persistent. They didn't stop singing because the weather was bad." Colt looked at the characters. "He wasn't wrong," he said. "No." She looked down at the page. "He wasn't wrong about many things. He just made one very large mistake and everything else fell over." "Do you miss him?" "The version of him from before," she said. "Yes, I miss the man who named me for persistence." She was quiet. "He became someone else when the money went. I don't know which version was real." "Maybe both," Colt said. "People can be 2 true things at once." Siu thought about this. "Can you—" He was quiet for long enough that she looked at him. He was looking at the rain. "I'm the man who built something alone for 7 years and told himself that was enough," he said. "And I'm the man who stood on that platform for 20 minutes working up the nerve to speak to a stranger because I couldn't make myself leave." He glanced at her. "Both true. Neither one the whole picture." She thought about the map he'd spread on the kitchen table 2 weeks ago, teaching her to read contour lines. "Here is where the land rises. Here is where the water goes. Here is what the shape of it means for moving through it." "Show me the map," she said, "the survey map of the northern parcel." He raised an eyebrow, but went inside and came back with the map, and they spread it between them on the porch step, holding the corners down against the wind. "These are the contour lines," he said, his finger tracing them. "Every line represents 20 feet of elevation. When they are close together—" "The slope is steep," she said. "You remembered." "I always remember things about land." She traced a section of the map. "The creek, it comes from the north through this lower section. If Creed gets the northern parcel, he controls where it bends." "That's the pressure point," Colt agreed. "Everything to the south of that bend is our winter range." Siu studied the map. The rain was easing slightly, the drumming softer. "There's another way to reach the creek," she said slowly. "Look this eastern slope. It's steep, but it's within our current property. If we cut a trail through here," she traced it, "we could bring the cattle down this way in an emergency. Longer, harder. But it doesn't cross the northern parcel." Colt looked where she was pointing. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking of that parcel as a necessity," he said. "Like losing it means losing the ranch." "And if it's not a necessity," she said, "then what he's threatening to take away is a convenience. Still bad, but survivable." He looked at her. "You just changed the shape of the problem." "I changed the map I was reading," she said. "Same territory." The rain had stopped. The cold had deepened, instead the kind that followed rain in Dakota February, and settled into everything it touched. Colt was still looking at her in that way steadily, with the complete attention he brought to things that mattered. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said most important things, once directly without preamble or performance, as if it were a fact he was reporting. Siu looked at the map and then at him. She had known at some level for weeks. The word hadn't been necessary. She'd felt it in the shape of the days, in the way they moved around each other, in the fact that she'd stopped thinking about the life she'd expected and started thinking only about this one. "I know," she said. "I love you too." He nodded once, as if confirming something he'd suspected. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. They sat with the map between them, and the cold coming up from the frozen ground, and the lamp behind them painting the porch in amber, and neither of them felt the need to add anything to what had been said. In the morning there would be work. There was always work. But tonight there was this rain smell and lamplight and a map of the territory they were learning to navigate together, and the plain fact of what they'd both just said sitting between them, comfortable as a third presence. Later, when they climbed to the sleeping loft, there was no space between them on the mattress. And when Siu woke in the night, the weight of his arm across her shoulders felt like the most natural thing she had encountered in years. She closed her eyes again. Here then, this then, yes. The investigation moved slowly as official investigations do. 2 weeks became 3. The territorial investigator, a man named Hargrove, arrived in Coldwater Flats and set up in the back room of Nora's cafe and began interviewing people with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that building a case meant not leaving gaps. He interviewed Siu and Colt together, then separately. He interviewed Delia Marsh for 2 days running. He interviewed Pastor Crane Nora Britton, the storekeeper Morrison, whose distaste for Creed, it transpired, was rooted in a foreclosure scare 3 years prior that had been resolved only because Morrison had a brother-in-law with legal knowledge. He also, Nora reported with satisfaction, interviewed 3 families from the outlying region who had lost properties to Creed's bank and had spent years assuming they had had no recourse. "He's finding the same pattern," Siu said, reading between Nora's lines. "That's what it sounds like," Nora agreed. "And once you see a pattern, it's hard to claim it's coincidence," Siu finished. Creed was present in town throughout this period. Siu saw him twice, once on the street where he looked through her with the deliberate non-acknowledgement of someone performing indifference. Once from the window of the cafe where he stood in front of his bank, talking to a man she didn't recognize with the body language of controlled urgency. "He's talking to his lawyer," Colt said at her shoulder. "I know. He's not going to go quietly." "I know that too." She turned from the window. "But he's defensive now. Defensive men make different mistakes than offensive ones." The mistake, when it came, was not the one she'd predicted. It came on a Tuesday afternoon when Siu was alone at the ranch. Colt had ridden out to check on the cattle, a routine he maintained regardless of everything else happening. She was at the kitchen table with the territorial land code, reading the sections on fraudulent transfers and what remedies were available. She heard horses in the yard, not one horse, several. She looked out the window, 3 men on horseback and a 4th larger figure on a black horse that she recognized. Creed. She did not go to this door. Instead, she went to the table where Colt kept his rifle and picked it up. She had been practicing since the 2nd week of their marriage. Colt had taught her matter-of-factly because he felt she should know how to manage everything on the property. She was not an expert. She was competent. She carried the rifle to the window and watched. Creed dismounted. He came to the door and knocked with the specific cadence of someone who was accustomed to having doors open for them. Siu opened the door and stood in the frame. He looked at the rifle. His expression did something complicated. "Mrs. Hadley," he said pleasantly, "is your husband here?" "No," she said. "What do you want, Mr. Creed?" "I wondered if we might have a conversation. Reasonable people can often find solutions that courts cannot." He smiled. "The investigation will conclude eventually. These things are rarely as significant as they appear initially." "What are you offering?" she asked. Something flickered in his eyes. He hadn't expected the direct question. He'd expected to be inside the cabin in control of the space setting the terms. "Drop the complaint," he said. "Both the Land Office filing and the Banking Commission filing confirmed to investigator Hargrove that there was a misunderstanding about the documents. In return, I'll drop the mortgage claim entirely. You keep the ranch, no complications." "And the other families," Siu said. "The ones whose properties you took." The smile didn't waver. "That's not relevant to your situation." "It is to me." She looked at him steadily. "You're asking me to help you evade consequences for things you did to other people. in exchange for not doing it to me. I'm offering you a way out of a prolonged legal process that will disrupt your life for—" "No," Siu said. He blinked. "The answer is no," she said. "We're not dropping anything. The investigation will proceed and you will face whatever it finds." She met his eyes. "You've been doing this for a long time, Mr. Creed. You've built a system for it, the careful legal framing, the pressure on the people who can witness against you, the patience to wait years for the right angle. It's effective, but it only works when people believe they have no other choice." She stepped back into the doorway slightly. "We have other choices. We've already used them." Creed's smile had gone. "Hadley married someone more trouble than he knew," he said. "He knew exactly," Siu said. "We talked about it before he proposed." A long moment, his eyes moved to the rifle. "You should leave," she said. "The investigator's office is 4 miles from here. I could reach it in under an hour." He left. He was controlled about it, no dramatic statements, no visible rage. The control itself was informative. She watched the horses disappear down the ranch road and then went back inside and sat down at the table. Her hands were shaking slightly. She put them flat on the table and waited for them to stop. She was still sitting there when Colt came in an hour later. He took in the rifle on the table and her expression and sat down across from her without asking questions, which was exactly what she needed. After a moment, she told him. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "You said no," he said. "Yes." "You stood in the door with a rifle and told him no." "Yes." "You know," he said, "he's going to try something else now." "I know." She looked at the table. "I thought about waiting, telling him I'd talk to you first. It would have bought time." "Why didn't you—" She thought about it. "Because I've spent a lot of my life waiting for the right moment to say no," she said. "Waiting for the moment when it would be safe, when I'd have enough support, when the ground would be solid enough. It's never solid enough. There's always a reason to wait." She looked up at him. "I'm done waiting." Colt looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Okay," he said. "What do we do next?" What Creed tried next was the Chuang Ngua. They found the fire at 3 in the morning. Colt woke to the smell of smoke, before any sound reached them, was out of the loft and running before Siu had fully understood what was happening. She went after him, pulling on her coat, and came around the corner of the cabin to find the east wall of the barn fully engulfed. The next 40 minutes were the worst of her life on the ranch. She handled the horses. Bishop and Rook came out quietly enough, but Gray had always been more sensitive and fought the lead rope until she managed to get low below the smoke and speak to him in the calm voice she'd been practicing, and eventually he came. Then she drove them all into the far paddock and came back to help Colt, who was fighting the fire at the barn's edge, trying to keep it from reaching the feed store attached to the south wall. They didn't save the barn, Gwen. They saved the feed store. They saved the equipment in the lean-to. They saved the cabin, which was not at risk, but felt at risk in the darkness and the chaos. They saved the animals. By the time the sun came up, the east wall was rubble and char, and the north half of the barn was a skeleton of blackened beams, and Siu sat on the fence of the paddock with Gray's head against her shoulder and watched Colt walk through the ruins, assessing damage. He came back to her. His face was black with soot and controlled in the way that meant he was very angry. 3 ignition points, he said. East wall feed store door, west corner. Someone knew what they were doing. Creed, Siu said. Hired someone, Colt said. He wouldn't have come himself. She looked at the ruined barn. The feed store had survived with damage to the exterior, but the interior largely intact, a critical fact for the cattle's survival through the rest of winter. The barn itself would need to be rebuilt, but the structure it stood on was salvageable. He thinks this breaks us, she said. Does it? She looked at him. He was looking back at her steadily, asking a real question. No, she said, it makes us angrier. That's what I thought. He looked at the ruins again. I need to go to Hargrove. Today. Now. Take me with you. They rode to town at first light, smelling of smoke, and found Investigator Hargrove at his customary table in Nora's cafe. They told him what had happened, what they'd found, what Creed had said on the porch the previous day. Hargrove listened with a face that gave away nothing. When they finished, he said, The visit yesterday, did you note the time? 3 in the afternoon, Siu said. He arrived, we spoke, approximately 10 minutes he left. Any witnesses? None at the ranch. He came himself with 3 men I didn't recognize. Hargrove made notes. I can't connect this directly to Creed without evidence, he said. Arson requires either witnesses or physical evidence linking the perpetrator to the scene. I know, Siu said, but it's part of the pattern. Yes. He set down his pen. It is that. He paused. Off the record, I've been in this territory for 12 years. I've seen what Creed does. The pattern is clear. What I need is something that will make it impossible to argue coincidence or misunderstanding in front of a judge. Something direct. The forged documents, Colt said, are strong but contestable, Hargrove said. Signatures can be disputed. Dates can be argued. What I need, he paused, choosing his words, is Creed in his own voice. Siu turned this over in her mind. He's confident, she said slowly. When he came to the ranch, he was controlled but confident. He still thinks he can manage this. Confident men keep records, Hargrove said. He looked at his coffee. That's all I'll say. That was enough. On the ride back to the ranch, Siu thought through what Hargrove had said and what he'd meant. Creed kept records because he was systematic, because he had always needed documentation to protect himself as much as to enable his schemes. Somewhere in his operation, there were records that would be more incriminating than anything they'd found so far. The bank, Colt said. His office, Siu said. Not the public area, the private records. Getting into his office. Getting into his office is not an option, she said firmly. Anything we found that way would be inadmissible and we'd end up arrested. That's not what Hargrove meant. What did he mean? She thought about it. He meant that there's a record we don't have to go looking for. Something that will come to light on its own if we give it room to. She turned the problem over for the rest of the ride home. Delia Marsh. Delia had worked in that bank for 2 years. She had prepared documents, managed accounts, seen the operation from the inside. Siu had interviewed her carefully and thoroughly, but there were things Delia knew that she hadn't been asked yet, things she'd accepted as normal banking practice without realizing their significance. That afternoon, Siu rode back to town alone and found Delia at Nora's. Tell me about the communication records, she said. The correspondence Creed sent and received. What happened to it? Delia frowned. He kept copies in the filing system. Outgoing correspondence, incoming, organized by year and by... She stopped. By what? He had 2 filing systems, Delia said slowly. The official records, which the tellers knew about, and a separate one in his private office, which I found when I was looking for something else. He said it was for important correspondence that needed separate storage. I thought he meant sensitive banking negotiations. She paused. I copied some of it when I copied the instructions for the Patterson lien. I thought at the time they might be relevant, but I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Siu waited. Delia reached into her coat and removed a small bundle of papers. She had, it turned out, been carrying more than Siu had known. The papers were letters, outgoing correspondence in Creed's handwriting, or clearly written under his direction. 3 of them addressed to his lawyer discussing specific foreclosures in terms that made the intent explicit. The family is in difficulty and will not contest the signature issue creates leverage sufficient for our purposes. Once the property transfers, we move immediately to the railroad contact. One was addressed to the man Siu had seen him speaking with outside the bank. The man's name was Curtis Webb. The letter discussed payment for services rendered and the importance of ensuring that the incident at the Hadley property left no traceable evidence. Curtis Webb, payment for services rendered. The incident at the Hadley property. The letter was dated 2 days after Siu had stood in the doorway with a rifle and said no. She sat back and looked at Delia Marsh, who was watching her with the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for too long and is only now understanding that they can set it down. Why didn't you give these to Hargrove immediately? Siu asked without accusation. Because I wasn't sure it was enough, Delia said. And because... She stopped. Because after Tommy was moved and I knew he was safe, I needed time to be sure that I wasn't making things worse, that going all the way meant going all the way. She looked at her hands. I'm sure now. Siu looked at the letter about Curtis Webb, at the date, at the clear, damning language of a confident man who believed his records were private. Take me to Hargrove, she said. Hargrove read the letters 3 times without speaking. When he looked up, his face was still neutral, but something had changed behind his eyes. Curtis Webb, he said. I know that name. He stood. Mrs. Hadley, I'm going to ask you to wait here while I make some inquiries. He paused at the door. This is good work. He was gone for 4 hours. When he came back, his expression had changed in a way that Siu recognized the particular resolution of someone who has confirmed what they suspected and can now move. Webb has a prior record, Hargrove said. Arson for hire Minnesota Territory 12 years ago. Charges were dropped. He sat down. He's currently in Coldwater Flats. I've been told he's been drinking heavily in the saloon since Tuesday, which is consistent with someone who recently did something they're not comfortable with. Can you arrest him? Siu asked. On this letter in his presence, enough for questioning. He looked at the papers. If he's been drinking and someone he doesn't know sits down and buys him another glass, that's not for me to know about, Siu said. No, Hargrove agreed. It isn't. She rode home and told Colt, and they waited. That night, the moon was full over the prairie, and the ruined barn cast shadows that looked like ribs, and Siu sat on the porch steps alone for a while, listening to the territory breathe around her, the wind in the dry grass, the creek running somewhere in the dark, the animals shifting in the paddock. She had been here 3 months. She had married a stranger. She had built something with her hands and her stubbornness and her particular way of reading the shape of things. Creed had tried to take it, and they had fought back, and tomorrow or the day after, a man who knew what Creed had hired him to do was sitting in a saloon talking to someone who looked like no one important. She thought about her father, who had made one very large mistake and watched everything fall over. She thought about what she'd said to Colt on the porch in the rain. He became someone else. I don't know which version was real. She thought about Colt's answer. People can be two true things at once. She was the woman who had stood in a doorway with a rifle and said no. And she was the woman who was afraid that courage was something she'd borrowed and would have to return eventually. Both true. She went inside. In the morning, she thought. One more morning, Curtis Webb talked. Hargrove told them on a Friday morning, arriving at the ranch with the specific purposefulness of someone delivering news they'd been holding carefully. Webb had given a statement. Hired by Creed 6 months ago for general purposes, with the barn fire specifically contracted after Creed's failed visit to the ranch. Payment in cash, instructions in person, no witnesses. The statement was signed. Webb had been motivated, Hargrove said with careful neutrality, by the fact that several other people had recently been willing to come forward, and he preferred not to be the last man standing when consequences arrived. Is it enough? Colt asked. Combined with everything else, Hargrove said. Yes, Creed's going to claim Webb is lying, that the letter is fabricated, that this is a coordinated attack on an honest businessman. His lawyer will make arguments. But a jury in this territory isn't going to look at a pattern of 10 years in a signed statement from a hired arsonist and conclude it's all coincidence. He paused. I'm applying for an arrest warrant today, he said. We'll have a circuit judge in town next Thursday for the regular session. The territorial banking commissioner is sending representation. This won't be a local proceeding. Siu exhaled slowly. The ranch, Colt said. The forged mortgage. Fraudulent. Voided by the investigation. The commissioner's office will confirm in writing within the week. Hargrove looked at him steadily. The northern parcel, the lien, is also fraudulent, as you know. The parcel will revert to available territory. You'll be able to file for the land adjacent under standard homestead provision. Colt stood very still. It's yours, Siu said quietly. You can have what you wanted. He looked at her, and she understood from his expression that the northern parcel had become considerably less important over the past 3 months than it had once been. Hargrove left. They stood in the yard in the March air, which was still cold but carried something different from February, eliciting a sense that the ground was beginning to consider thawing. It's not over, Siu said. The trial will take time. I know. He looked at the ruined barn. We should start rebuilding. Spring's coming. The cattle are going to need Colt. He looked at her. It's all right, she said. We won. What the final win, the trial was still weeks away, and Creed's lawyer was formidable, and there were arguments to be made and documentation to be reviewed and a formal proceeding to survive. But the shape of it had changed. The investigation had found what it was looking for. The momentum had shifted. We won, he said, trying the words out. Yeah, she agreed. He laughed, a short, surprised sound like it had escaped before he could think about it. She had heard him laugh before, but not like that, unguarded, the specific relief of someone who has been holding tension for so long that its release is almost physical. She stepped forward, and he pulled her in, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt him breathe. And outside, the March wind moved through the skeletal remains of the barn like it was learning the shape of the space. They stayed like that for a while. Then she said against his coat, "We need to hire someone to help with the barn." He laughed again, and she felt it in his chest. "Yeah," he said, "we do." Over the following week, the community proved itself in a way that Siu had been told about, but hadn't quite believed until she saw it. Nora organized. Nora was very good at organizing, which everyone in Coldwater Flats apparently knew, and had simply been waiting for the right cause to demonstrate. Within 4 days, she had commitments from 11 families, lumber labor time tools. A barn raising was scheduled for the Saturday before the trial. "You don't have to do this," Colt told Nora when she rode out to explain the plan. "You're right," she said cheerfully. "I also don't have to breathe technically, but I prefer to." She turned to Siu. "There will be women who won't come because of—" She paused delicately. "Because I'm Chinese," Siu said. "Yes. There will also be women who come specifically to meet you, so it will balance out." "That's a reasonable accounting," Siu said. "I thought you'd see it that way." The barn raising was on a Saturday that arrived cold and clear and full of wind. 43 people came. The women who hadn't wanted to come did not come. The ones who'd been curious arrived with covered dishes and frank assessments of Colt Hadley's apparent improvement since acquiring a wife, which Siu received with the politeness she'd practiced her whole life and the amusement she was still learning to show openly. By sunset, the frame stood complete, and they ate together in the cold air. And people who had spent years afraid of Creed's bank spoke to each other about it openly for what was clearly the first time. Mrs. Harmon, whose husband had lost a property 4 years ago, sat beside Siu on the porch steps and said, "I always thought it was our fault, that we'd been foolish." "You weren't foolish," Siu said. "You trusted that the law protected you." "And it didn't." "It didn't then," Siu said. "It will now. That's what the trial is for." Mrs. Harmon was quiet. "You're not afraid of him," she said. "I'm afraid," Siu said. "I just stopped waiting until I wasn't." Later, after everyone had gone home, she and Colt stood in front of the new frame in the dark. It was skeletal. Still, it would take more work, more time, more days of showing up, but it stood against the sky solid and particular, and theirs. "You change things here," Colt said quietly. "We change things. You know what I mean." He was looking at the frame. "People have been waiting for someone to start. You started." Siu thought about her father naming her for a bird that sang in bad weather. She thought about the train platform and the cold and the man who'd stood 20 minutes in it, working up the nerve to speak. "You started," she said. "On the platform. Everything else followed from that." He turned to look at her. "You both started," she said. "We both did. That's how it works." He smiled, that rare full smile she'd been collecting, memorizing, adding to a private catalog of things she wanted to keep. "Yeah," he said. "I guess that's exactly how it works." Inside, the lamp was lit against the dark, and the new frame cast long shadows in the moonlight and in Coldwater Flats, Dakota territory. In the spring of 1888, something had shifted that would not shift back. The decision Colt made, he made alone. That was the first problem. He made it on a Tuesday, 4 days before the trial, while Siu was in town with Hargrove reviewing the documentation order. He'd stayed behind to work on the barn, which was what he told her and what he intended, and then he found something. He'd been working in what remained of the original east wall clearing, charred timber, assessing what could be salvaged when his boot turned a piece of board that didn't belong. Beneath it, preserved in the narrow gap between the wall base and the ground by the fire's strange geometry, was a wooden box. The box contained papers, 2 of them. One was the copy of the Patterson lien instructions they'd already given to Hargrove Delia's copy, but this was a second copy in Creed's handwriting. The second was something else. It was a document in Creed's hand addressed to his lawyer outlining the full strategy, the forged mortgage, the land play, the railroad contact, and in the third paragraph, the question of Hadley's wife, who is proving a complication. The situation may require additional measures to ensure she does not remain an active participant in proceedings. Additional measures. Colt had stood in the ruins of his barn and read this sentence 6 times. He had thought about Siu standing in the doorway with a rifle. He had thought about what additional measures meant when used by a man who had already hired someone to burn a barn. He had thought about the trial in 4 days, and what it would mean if Creed felt he was losing it. He had thought about the letter. If this letter reached Hargrove, it would be powerful evidence. It would also tell Creed through his lawyer's discovery process that they had it, and it would tell him before the trial. 4 days was enough time to do something. He had also thought, and this was the reasoning he would revisit and regret for years, that if the letter was not in Hargrove's evidence file, it could not be disclosed to Creed's defense. The forged mortgage instruction, Delia's copies, Webb's statement, the documentation they'd assembled over 3 months, that was enough. This second letter was insurance. Insurance for what? For the part of his mind that could not stop seeing the sentence, additional measures, and connecting it to Siu standing in the doorway with a rifle and thinking about what happened to people who became complications for men like Creed. He burned the letter. He did it in the barn ruins debris pile, which was still smoldering in places from the fire. He watched the paper curl and blacken and become nothing, and he told himself he'd made the rational decision, and he almost believed it. He told Siu that evening. He told her the way he told her difficult things directly, without preamble, in the same tone he'd used for facts about the ranch. "I found a document today," he said, "in the barn ruins, a letter from Creed to his lawyer." She looked up from the land code she'd been reviewing. He told her what the letter said. He told her what he'd done. The silence that followed was the longest of their marriage. "You burned it," she said. "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." She set down the book. She did not look at him. He understood in the silence that he had made a mistake. Not the burning, or not only the burning, but the alone. He had made a decision that affected both of them without asking her. He had decided what she needed to be protected from and acted on that decision unilaterally. He had done exactly what he told her he wouldn't do. "Siu," he said. "I know why you did it," she said. Her voice was very even. "I understand the reasoning. The sentence about additional measures, you were afraid for me." "Yes." "And you decided by yourself that I shouldn't know about that threat until after it was eliminated." She paused. "And then you eliminated the evidence along with the threat." He could not argue with this description. It was accurate. "The other evidence is sufficient," he said. Hargrove confirmed. "That's not the point." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were not angry, which was somehow worse than anger. They were careful. "We decided together to go to the Capitol. We decided together to approach Delia. We decided together every step of this, and then you found a piece of evidence, and you decided alone. I was protecting you." "I know." She turned back to the window. "I've been protected like that before. Men who made decisions about what I needed to know and what I was better off not knowing. Men who thought the kindest thing they could do would manage the information I received." She was very still. "I came here because you weren't like that." Colt sat with this. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you are." She paused. "Was the letter actually significant beyond what we already have?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe, maybe not." "Did Hargrove need it?" "I don't know that either." Another silence. "Here is what I'm going to tell you," Siu said carefully. "I'm not angry about the burning. You made a judgment call. It might have been wrong. It might have been right. We won't know. What I'm angry about—" She stopped. "What I need you to understand is that additional measures is a threat against me, and I had a right to know about it and to make my own decisions about how to respond to it. You took that from me." "Yes," Colt said, "I did. Don't do it again." "I won't." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight was doing something complicated to her face, not softening it exactly, but revealing the layers of it. The woman who had stood at his door with a rifle. The woman who had read the lien document 4 times and found the date. The woman who had said, "I've spent a lot of my life waiting for the right moment to say no. I love you," she said. "I'm also very annoyed with you." "Those seem compatible," he said carefully. "They are." She turned back to the land code. "Now, we have 3 days before the trial, and I want to walk through the documentation order one more time." He pulled up his chair. They worked for 2 more hours, and she let him help, and in the morning she kissed him before he went to the barn, and they did not speak of the letter again. But Siu thought about it while she was reviewing documents, while she was riding to town to meet with Hargrove, while she lay awake the night before the trial. She thought about what it meant that he'd done it. She thought about what it meant that he'd told her afterward that he hadn't simply buried the decision, that he'd come home and sat across the table and told her directly, knowing she would be angry because he had promised honesty, and even painful honesty counted. She thought about additional measures and the fact that she was still here, still unharmed, 3 months into a life she'd chosen by saying yes to a stranger on a train platform. She thought about how frightened he must have been reading that letter, how frightened he still was, how badly he'd wanted to make the threat not exist. She understood it. She also was not going to pretend he'd been right. Both true. People can be two true things at once. In the morning of the trial, she braided her hair with her mother's jade comb and put on the warmest and most composed thing she owned, and she walked into the Coldwater Flats courthouse beside her husband. The hearing room was full. Creed sat at the front with his lawyer, a formidable man from Bismarck, who had a reputation for making complicated things simple and simple things complicated in whatever direction served his client. Creed's face was composed. His hands were still. Investigator Hargrove sat across from them with a leather folder that contained 3 months of work. Delia Marsh sat in the witness gallery with Tommy beside her. He'd been brought from the schoolmaster's house so Delia could see him, and he sat with the particular solemnity of an 11-year-old who understood something important was happening without fully understanding what. He held his sister's hand. Siu and Colt sat behind Hargrove. Nora Britton was in the third row. Mrs. Harmon was there. Morrison, the storekeeper. 11 families from the valley. Curtis Webb, pale and sober, sitting between 2 territorial deputies. The circuit judge was a woman named Aldrich, the first woman Siu had seen in a position of official authority in this territory, which she noted and filed away. Judge Aldrich was perhaps 50, with the economical bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people underestimated her and had stopped finding it interesting. She reviewed the case summary. She called Hargrove to present the evidence. The documentation took an hour. Delia's statement, the Patterson death certification, Gerald Fong's legal analysis, the instructions in Creed's handwriting, the Webb letter, Webb's word signed confession. Hargrove was methodical and clear the way of someone who had been building this for weeks and knew exactly where each piece fit. Creed's lawyer cross-examined. He raised questions about the chain of custody of the documents. He suggested that Delia Marsh had motives for fabrication based on her father's history with Creed. He called Webb's credibility into question. He was technically very good. Then Judge Aldrich said, "Mrs. Hadley, I understand you have some personal knowledge of the documentation." Siu stood. She had prepared for this moment carefully and had also prepared for the fact that preparation might not be enough. She had grown up reading her father's accounts and learning the difference between what documents said and what they meant. She had spent her adult life in situations where she was underestimated and had become proficient at using that underestimation as a tool. She stood before Judge Aldrich in a courtroom full of people, and she said, "Your Honor, the defense has raised questions about the date on the lien document. I'd like to address the document's other structural problems." Judge Aldrich looked at her steadily. "Proceed." Siu had read the Territorial Banking Code. She had read the 1883 version and the 1885 version because Gerald Fong had mentioned in his letter that the document contained language that postdated its supposed creation. She described 3 specific clauses in the lien document that had not been part of standard banking practice in 1883, citing the code revision dates with the precision of someone who had read them until she could recite them. She described the specific language changes. She described which version of which clause had been used in the document and when that version had become standard. The defense lawyer made an objection. Judge Aldrich overruled it. Siu continued. She described the lien's collateral terms that in 1883 would have required specific additional witnessing not present in the document. She cited the Territorial Land Code section and paragraph. She had memorized the section number. This document, she said, could not have been prepared in 1883 by anyone familiar with the legal standards of that time. It could only have been prepared by someone working from a later template who did not notice that the template they were using had been revised twice since the date they were forging. The courtroom was very quiet. She looked at Judge Aldrich. "The document is false," she said, "not just because of the signature date, because of the legal DNA of the thing itself. It carries the marks of when it was actually written." She sat down. Colt's hand found hers under the table. She held it. Judge Aldrich asked the defense lawyer if he had a response to the legal analysis. The defense lawyer had, in fact, a response prepared for many things. He did not have a response for this particular analysis delivered in detail he had not anticipated from a witness he had categorized incorrectly. His response was brief. It raised questions he could not specifically answer. It trailed. Judge Aldrich gave him a moment. Then she said, "I have sufficient basis to rule." She ruled. The ruling took 20 minutes to deliver in full, but the substance of it was clear in the first two. The lien on the northern parcel was fraudulent and void. The forged mortgage was fraudulent and void. The foreclosure proceedings were dismissed with prejudice, meaning Creed could not refile. The evidence presented was sufficient to support criminal referral on charges of fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit arson, and potentially additional charges pending review. Judge Aldrich ordered Creed held pending the criminal hearing. She also, in the final two paragraphs of her ruling, addressed the families whose properties had been foreclosed under Creed's previous schemes. She could not restore their land directly. The transfers were legally complex, and some had already been resold. But she ordered a full audit of Creed's banking records going back to his arrival in the territory, with restitution proceedings to follow wherever fraud could be established. The families who lost property through fraudulent foreclosure, she said, looking at the gallery, are not without recourse. The process will take time, but the process will occur. Mrs. Harmon in the third row was very still. The room did not erupt exactly. It was too crowded and too cold for that. But a sound went through it, the collective exhale of people who had been holding something for years and were now very carefully beginning to set it down. Sho felt Colt's hand tighten around hers. Outside the courthouse in the pale March sun, people came to them. Nora, who gripped Sho's arm and didn't say anything which was out of character and therefore significant. Delia Marsh with Tommy beside her, who looked at Sho with an expression she had seen before on people who have passed through something difficult and come out the other side of it and don't yet know what to do with the relief. "Thank you," Delia said. "You did it," Sho said. "You kept the evidence when it would have been easier not to. You testified when you had reason to be afraid." "I learned from someone," Delia said simply. Tommy pulled at his sister's sleeve and said something too quietly to hear. Delia smiled for the first time Siu had seen a full, unguarded smile that changed her whole face. "He wants to know if we can go get pie," she said. "That is an excellent idea," Siu said. "All of us." They went to Nora's cafe, all of them, a crowd of people who had spent years in the orbit of the same problem from different angles and now were sitting in the warmth together. Nora served pie and coffee without anyone having to ask. Morrison, the storekeeper, talked to Mrs. Harmon, and Siu could see from across the room that whatever he was saying was something that had needed to be said for 3 years. The schoolmaster, who had taken Tommy in, sat in the corner and looked moderately overwhelmed and quite happy. Colt beside Siu was quiet in the way she'd come to understand as processing, absorbing what had happened, finding the shape of it, integrating it into the landscape of what he knew. "She cited the code," he said finally. Section and paragraph, from memory. I read it a lot." He turned to look at her. "The defense lawyer didn't know what to do with you." "He categorized me incorrectly," Siu said. "It's a useful thing to let people do sometimes. You get more time to prepare. Did you expect that he'd underestimate you?" She thought about it honestly. "I hoped. I wasn't certain." She paused. "I was more afraid than I sounded." "You sounded unafraid." "I know." She looked at her coffee cup. "I'm not sure that's always honest, but in that situation, sounding unafraid mattered." Colt was quiet for a moment. "The sentence about additional measures," he said. "I should have told you. I know I should have told you, but he stopped. "I've spent 7 years building something I didn't want to lose. And then you came and it turned out the thing I didn't want to lose had changed into something bigger, something more." He looked at the table. "I didn't know how to hold that and let you be in danger at the same time." Siu looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said, "but I've spent my whole life having things decided for me about what I could handle knowing. My father hiding the debts until it was too late. Arthur Fong's matchmaker managing what I was told. Even the conductor on the train, he waited until we were almost at the station to tell me about Arthur being gone." She met his eyes. "I need to know the things that affect me. Even the difficult things. Especially those." "I understand," he said. "I'll do better." "I know you will." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I'm not asking you to be different than you are. I'm asking you to bring me along." He turned his hand over so their fingers were interlaced. "That's what I want too," he said. "That's the only thing I've wanted since the platform." They stayed in Nora's cafe until the afternoon light went golden and the pie was gone and people had drifted away in twos and threes, and then they walked out into the March air and stood for a moment on the main street of Coldwater Flats, which looked exactly the same as it had that morning and felt completely different. "Ready," Colt said. 9 miles. Siu agreed. They drove home through the long light of early spring. The horses comfortable on a familiar road, and the conversation moved through ranch logistics to the barn finishing schedule, to what to plant in the kitchen garden. Siu was learning gradually the satisfaction of growing things from ground you knew to quieter territory. "What do you want?" Colt asked. "Not the ranch, not next year's herd. What do you want for yourself?" Siu thought about it. "I want to read every land code in this territory," she said. "Not because of creed, just because I find them interesting. The way they were written, the arguments that created them." "You'd be good at law," Colt said. "Possibly." She watched the prairie go by. Gerald Fong, the lawyer in San Francisco, he mentioned in his letter that the territory has been discussing whether to allow women to pass the bar. It won't happen soon. Maybe not in my lifetime. A pause. "But I could study?" "Then study." She looked at him. "You don't mind?" He returned the look briefly, then went back to the road. "You're my partner," he said. "What you want matters. We figure out how to make it work. That's what partners do." She turned back to watch the last of the sun go down over the prairie. It was not the life she'd planned when she'd read those 17 letters. It was not the life she'd imagined when she'd stepped off the train into the cold. It was better than both of those in ways she hadn't had the vocabulary for before she'd lived them. "I want something else too," she said. "What?" She had been certain for 2 weeks. She'd told no one yet. "There will be 3 of us," she said. "Come winter." The wagon stopped. She turned to find Colt looking at her with an expression she had seen only once before on the porch in the rain when he'd said the word love for the first time. Complete unguarded. "Yeah," he said. His voice had gone rough. "Yes." He reached for her and she went, and they stayed like that for a long time on the empty prairie road, with the first stars coming out above them, and the horses patient and the world very quiet. And Siu felt something settle in her chest that she recognized now as peace. Not the absence of difficulty, not the end of hard things, just the steady, bone-deep knowledge that she was in the right place with the right person, building the right life. Here then. This then, yes. Spring arrived the way it always does on the Dakota prairie, abruptly, then relentlessly, as if the land had been waiting all winter for permission to try again. The barn went up in 3 weekends of communal effort. Colt had accepted the help without his usual resistance, which Siu understood was its own kind of growth. He was not by nature someone who allowed people to see what he needed. He was learning. She was learning things too. She was learning the names of the grasses that came in first the winter. Wheat Colt had planted the previous fall, the wild grasses emerging in the low areas, the forbs that showed up in the garden plot before she planted anything. She was learning the cattle's spring behavior, the way the herd reorganized itself as calves arrived and the social architecture shifted. She was learning that she had an unexpected facility for the mechanical work of a ranch. The fence repair, the equipment, maintenance, and that Colt had noticed this with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose faith in a good investment is being confirmed. She was also, with careful regularity, reading the territorial statutes. "You're going to want your own desk," Colt said one evening, looking at the spread of documents across the kitchen table. "There isn't room." "We could add a room." She looked up. "You've said the cabin needs work." "It always needs work," he agreed. "Might as well do the useful kind." They discussed it over several evenings, the shape of the addition, what function it would serve, what it would cost in time and materials. Planning together the way they'd learned to plan everything, her reading the structures of things, him knowing the physical requirements. Both of them talking through the parts where neither was certain until a solution emerged that neither would have found alone. On a Saturday in May, Nora came out to the ranch for what she described as a social call, and what everyone understood was an inspection. She walked through the new barn. She looked at the garden. She had coffee with Siu on the porch while Colt was working with the horse, and talked about the territory, the changes coming, the ways in which the Creed case had shifted something and how people related to each other. The Harmon family got a restitution offer this week. Nora said. From the audit. Will it be enough? Siu asked. Not entirely. They can't get the land back and it's been sold twice over, but the money will let them start over somewhere. Nora paused. Mrs. Harmon asked me to tell you, thank you. Siu looked at the prairie. Spring had turned it the particular shade of new green that still surprised her every time. We all did it, she said. You keep saying that, Nora observed. It keeps being partially untrue. People were ready to fight, Siu said. They just needed someone to go first, Nora said. Yes, that's what I mean. Delia Marsh had taken a position with a law office in the capital. Gerald Fong had written with a recommendation after reviewing her work, and it had been received well. She wrote to Siu occasionally short practical letters about what she was learning with small items about Tommy at the end. He was doing well. He liked school. He wanted to know if Mrs. Hadley had a horse he could visit sometime. Colt's answer to this had been immediate and unequivocal, of course, whenever he likes to let us know. The criminal trial for Creed was set for August in the territorial capital. Siu and Colt would both testify. She had begun to think of it not with dread, but with the purposeful calm of an upcoming task, something to prepare for, to do well to complete. On an evening in late June, sitting on the porch she had claimed as her thinking space, watching the light go long and golden over the prairie grass, she felt the baby move for the first time. She sat very still, her hand on her middle, waiting to see if it would happen again. It did. Colt came around the corner of the cabin a few minutes later and found her there. What is it? He asked immediately. She took his hand and placed it where she'd felt the movement. They waited. And then small and unmistakable again. He looked up at her with that expression that had no armor in it, that was simply what it was. Hi, he said quietly to the small presence making itself known. Siu laughed a full, unguarded sound that startled a bird from the garden, and Colt looked at her with warm eyes, and the prairie went gold around them in the evening light. Here then, this life, this choice made daily renewed, daily built from days of showing up and being honest, and carrying the hope for each other on the bones when it was heavy. She had come to Dakota territory with nowhere to go. She had stayed because a stranger had been honest about his shortcomings and trusted her with the truth from the first hour. She was still staying every day, choosing to stay, and finding to her continuing genuine surprise that it was exactly enough, more than enough, home. The criminal trial in August was shorter than any of them expected. Creed's lawyer had spent 4 months preparing a defense. He had briefs, expert witnesses, arguments about the chain of custody of each document, a theory about a coordinated conspiracy by the Hadley family and their associates to frame an innocent banker. He had spent what was, by available accounts, a significant amount of money in preparation. On the third day, Creed entered a plea. Not guilty, reduced to a negotiated arrangement, the lawyer's work presumably finding a floor beneath which prison time was preferable to the ongoing exposure of a full trial. Creed pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges. He waived his right to continue operating as a banker in any United States territory. He agreed to cooperate with the audit and the restitution proceedings. He received a sentence of 12 years. The courtroom did not erupt. The families who had gathered to witness sat quietly with the particular stillness of people who have waited long enough that a clean ending feels slightly unreal. Siu was in the 6th row. She had testified on the first day clearly without drama, the same way she'd spoken in Coldwater Flats, and had watched the defense lawyer's strategy unravel incrementally against the accumulated weight of 3 months of documentation. It had not been satisfying exactly. It was more like the release of pressure, the specific relief of a problem that has been solved. When the sentence was read, she looked at Delia Marsh across the room. Delia was holding Tommy's hand. He was 12 now, taller than he'd been in spring, looking around the courtroom with the bright curiosity of a boy who had survived something and come out of it somehow intact. Delia caught Siu's look. She nodded once. Colt's hand found Siu's shoulder, and she covered it with her own. Outside afterward, in the August heat, Judge Aldrich found them. Mrs. Hadley, she said, I wanted to speak with you. She spoke to them together, which Siu appreciated. She said that the case had been significant, that it had demonstrated in ways that would be referenced for years the importance of both meticulous documentation and the willingness of ordinary people to take on extraordinary risk for the sake of something right. She said that she had noticed in Siu's testimony and in her arguments before the court a particular quality of legal reasoning. The territory's bar examination, she said, will be open to women beginning next year. The legislature passed it in May. She paused. I mention it because it seems relevant. Sio looked at her. I know, she said. I've been reading. Judge Aldrich smiled, brisk approving. Good, she said and moved on. Colt looked at Sio. You already knew, he said. I found it in the Territorial Gazette in July. She looked ahead at the street. I've been practicing with the statutes since March. And you didn't tell me. I was waiting until I was sure I wanted it. She turned to look at him. I'm sure. He studied her face. Whatever he saw there appeared to answer the question he was considering. Okay, he said. How do we make it work? She had already been thinking through the answer to this question for 3 months. She had been reading case law and procedural codes and the history of the territorial bar and the practical realities of what studying while running a ranch and raising a child would actually require. She had been writing it out in the small journal, which was nearly full now. She told him. He listened the way he listened, and when she finished, he said, That's going to be hard. Yes. We're going to need more help on the ranch. Yes. We should find someone this fall before you're too far along to actually now. We should start looking now. He was already planning, which meant he'd accepted it and moved to implementation. Nora might know someone who needs work. She might, Sio agreed. I was going to ask her. You had already decided to ask her. I was going to tell you first. He gave her a look that held underneath it the memory of the burned letter and its aftermath. Right, he said. Good. I'm telling you now, she said. I know. He looped an arm around her shoulders. Let's go home. They drove back to Coldwater Flats in the August heat, the territory stretching flat and golden on all sides, the sky an enormous blue that still sometimes caught Sio off guard after months of getting used to its scale. She had come from the compressed streets and hills of San Francisco to a landscape that simply did not stop, and she had learned gradually to let herself be small inside it without finding that frightening. The ranch appeared around the final bend, nestled in its shallow valley, the new barn standing beside the old cabin, the creek line visible in the trees, the summer grass long against the fences. 40 head of cattle in the near pasture, and the garden green and full, and smoke beginning to rise from the chimney because someone was starting supper. They had hired a girl named Ruth, 15, from a family 3 valleys over, who had more children than work for them. She came 3 days a week and was learning to cook on Show's system, which involved more organization than she'd previously encountered and which she'd taken to with gratifying speed. Ruth appeared at the door when they pulled in. I started the beans, she said, and I think one of the calves got into the garden. Colt got down from the wagon with the particular expression of a man who has learned to accept calf and garden as a category of problem. Which one? The brown one with the ear? Of course it was. He went toward the garden without further comment. Ruth helped Sio down from the wagon, eyes going to her middle with the frank assessment of someone who has grown up around pregnant women. How was the capital? It's finished, Sio said. The trial. Ruth absorbed this. Is Creed in prison? For 12 years. Ruth nodded with satisfaction. Good, she said and went back inside. Sio stood for a moment in the yard in the August heat. She thought about February, the train, the cold, the platform, the bag that held everything she owned. She thought about the man who had stood 20 minutes working up the nerve to cross the space between them. She put her hand on her middle where a particular small presence was becoming increasingly opinionated about available space. We're home, she said, not to anyone in particular, and to everyone. In the evening after supper, after Ruth had gone and the dishes were done, and Colt was sitting at the table with a calf management problem he was working through in pencil, Sio brought the nearly full journal to the table and set it in front of her. She opened it to a new page. She had been keeping in the back of the journal a list of things she knew now that she had not known in February. It was not a formal accounting, it was disorganized, mixed with observations and notes and calculations, the way she actually thought. But tonight she wanted to write the important parts. She wrote, the shape of the territory from above is about water. Everything follows from where the water goes. She wrote, Colt's hands can hold very large things carefully. She wrote, people who have been afraid for a long time need someone to go first. Sometimes that person is you. She wrote, legal language from 1885 does not belong in a document dated 1883. Anyone reading carefully will find this. She wrote last, home is not the place you arrived. It is the place you kept choosing. She closed the journal. Colt looked up from his pencil work. What are you writing? Things I know, she said. More than you knew in February. She thought about it. Considerably, she said. He smiled that smile she had been collecting since March that had become one of the things she knew. Yeah, he said. Me too. Outside the Dakota, summer was full of sound crickets. The cattle, the creek, the particular singing of the wind that moved across the prairie grass and found every variation of its own voice. The lamp on the table made a small, warm world inside the cabin walls, and in that world, two people sat companionably close, working at the things that needed working at, quiet in the way that means something. The baby kicked. Yik pressed her hand there, feeling the small insistence of a presence that would arrive in the world in November and would be named. They had been deciding for weeks without quite deciding, something that meant perseverance, something that meant beginning, something that meant the particular stubbornness of a thing that blooms even when the ground is cold. She had an idea about the name. She would tell Colt in the morning. That was how they worked. She would tell him, and he would listen with his full attention, and they would talk about it and come to it together, and it would be a decision they'd both made. Not because either of them had been careful about keeping the habit, though they had been after the burned letter with a new kind of care, but because that was who they'd become. Two people who brought the important things to the same table. In the morning, then. For now, the lamp, the sound of pencil on paper. The cricket-filled dark outside. The small country of warmth and awe. That was enough. That was exactly enough. The train had come into Coldwater Flats on a February afternoon, and a woman with nowhere to go had stepped off it into the cold. And a man had stood at the far end of the platform, waiting to see if he was brave enough. He had been. She had been. And from those two ordinary acts of courage, small, terrified, real, everything else had followed. That was how it worked, she had learned. That was exactly how it worked. The Creed restitution proceedings concluded in October, 3 weeks before the baby arrived. It was not a clean or complete resolution, the law rarely was, as Siu was learning in her reading. Properties could not be fully restored. Years of displacement could not be undone. But 4 families received meaningful financial restitution, and the Territorial Banking Commission implemented new oversight requirements that became over the following decade a model for neighboring territories. The Creed case was cited in 3 subsequent fraud proceedings by name. Siu found this out the second time because Delia wrote to tell her. Delia had passed her first certification exam. She wrote about it in her usual brief, practical way, 2 sentences about the exam, 1 sentence noting that her supervisor had expressed surprise she'd passed on the first attempt, and then a correction of herself in the margin. He hadn't expected it. I had. Then a paragraph about Tommy, who had joined a school debate club and apparently had opinions about everything. Siu wrote back that this seemed like an excellent development and that Tommy was welcome to visit the ranch anytime. She added at the bottom that she had enrolled in the Territorial Bar Preparation course, which began in January. She did not add that she had already been unofficially studying for months because Delia would deduce this and approve, and the deduction was more satisfying than the announcement. The baby came on a Tuesday in November, which Siu noted afterward was fitting. She had arrived in the territory on a Friday, married on a Friday, and had been born on a Thursday herself. So having a child arrive on a Tuesday was a good statistical break from patterns. The labor was long. Nora attended, and 2 other women from town who had, between them, helped with more births than they could count. Colt paced a trench in the floor of the main room until Nora sent him to check on the cattle with a firmness that was not actually about the cattle. When he came back, there was a baby. She was small and dark-haired and had her father's particular set to her jaw, which would cause problems eventually, and was currently causing Siu a level of feeling that she had no adequate vocabulary for in either language. Colt came up the ladder to the loft and sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at his daughter for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at Siu. Hope, Siu had said weeks ago when she'd thought of it. Hope, he'd said. Because wrens sing in bad weather, she'd said, and we have been and she will be. He'd agreed without the need for further discussion. Now he looked at Hope Hadley, who was looking back at him with the focused attention of someone who has just arrived in a new territory and is taking stock. Hello, he said quietly. Hope blinked. She looks like you, Siu said. She looks like both of us, he said. The chin is definitely yours. The stubbornness will be yours. He smiled. She collected it. We're going to have to be better people, he said, than we already are. We'll try, Siu said. We'll keep trying. He reached for her hand and she gave it, and the three of them were there in the lamplight of the sleeping loft in the November cold, and outside the Dakota winter was arriving with its usual indifference to everything except its own enormous nature. Inside was warm. Inside was enough. The months that followed have the quality and memory of the kind of ordinary time that people only understand as precious after it passes. The work of a ranch in winter, the work of learning to be parents, the work of studying law while nursing a baby who had strong opinions about the study of law and expressed them primarily through sleeping on the relevant books. Colt proved himself, without apparent effort, to be the kind of father who could be handed a baby and continue whatever task he was doing, which was operationally crucial, and also struck a show as one of the more endearing things she'd yet observed about him. He sang to Hope in the evenings off-key and unself-conscious, and she appeared to appreciate the effort. Ruth, who came 3 days a week and had increased to 4 after Hope arrived, had strong opinions about baby management and delivered them with the confidence of someone who had helped raise 6 younger siblings. These opinions were occasionally helpful. Spring came again, and then on a morning in May, a year and 3 months after Siu had stepped off a train into the February cold, she sat on the porch with Hope asleep against her chest, and the statutes on her knee, and the prairie spread out before her in the particular green of Dakota spring, and she thought, all right, she had come here with nothing. She had a ranch and a partner and a daughter and a direction. She had a community she'd helped change and a practice of courage she was still building, and a case law library that was taking over the table. She had a man who had stood 20 minutes in the cold for her. She had a life she had chosen every day in the specific way that real things require, not once dramatically, but repeatedly in the small daily decisions of staying and working and telling the truth even when it was difficult and carrying hope for each other on the heavy days. She looked at the prairie. Here she had thought in February. Here then. She had been right. Here, then, now, still, for the foreseeable and uncountable future. She turned the page and kept reading. The bar examination was held in Bismarck on a Thursday in September in a room that smelled of chalk and old wood and the particular anxiety of people who had prepared for something important. Siu had been preparing for 9 months in the specific way she prepared for things thoroughly without drama, with consistent attention to what she didn't know yet and systematic effort to address those gaps. She had mailed questions to Gerald Fong in San Francisco. She had corresponded with Delia about procedural questions. She had read case law until she could trace the reasoning of decisions backward to the principles they rested on. She had also in the mornings when Hope allowed it, and occasionally when she didn't, reviewed the specific sections of territorial statute that she had memorized for the Creed trial because you never wasted something useful. The examination lasted 2 days. She did not know how it had in the way that you never quite know during the thing itself. She had answered everything. She had used the time. Colt met her outside the examination hall at the end of the second day. He had ridden up that morning, leaving the ranch in Ruth's capable hands, because he had decided it was important to be there, which was the kind of decision he made without requiring an explanation. How was it? He asked. I don't know yet, she said. I answered everything. That seems like the right approach, he said. She looked at him in the September afternoon, taller than she'd thought that first day, or perhaps she'd simply grown used to the scale of him, worn from the ride and calm and present in the way she had come to rely on without thinking about it, much the way you rely on ground that holds. I might not have passed, she said. Then you'll take it again. Yes, she agreed, I will. They stood in the Bismarck Street for a moment, the examination behind her and the rest of it ahead. And then he said, there's a good restaurant 2 streets over that Nora recommended. She said we should go if you deserved a celebration, and if you didn't deserve a celebration, we should go anyway, because the food was worth it regardless. Siu laughed. Nora has a practical philosophy, she said. She does, Colt agreed. I've come to appreciate it. They went to dinner. The letter arrived 6 weeks later. She read it standing at the kitchen table with Hope balanced on her hip. Colt was outside. She stood with the letter in her hand for a moment, feeling the particular stillness that follows something completed. Then she went to the door. Colt. He came over from the fence he'd been repairing. She held out the letter. He read it. He looked up. She was watching him with the expression he had come to know as her quiet form of joy, held back slightly, not because it wasn't real, but because some feelings were too significant for immediate full expression, and needed to be approached carefully. Counselor Hadley, he said. She took the letter back. You can call me CO, she said. He smiled. She filed it in the tin box from the lean-to, the one that still held her mother's jade comb, in the marriage certificate from Pastor Crane, and a small wooden token Colt had carved the previous winter, shaped like a wren. The box was full now of things that had mattered. She thought it might need to be replaced soon with something larger. A new tin box for the next set of things. That seemed about right. Outside the window, the October prairie was the color of old gold, and the cattle were fat from summer grazing, and the new barn stood solid against the sky, and in the kitchen, Hope was saying something emphatic in a private language that would become words eventually, but for now was simply sound and intention. Here, thought Siu Wren Hadley, counselor at law, wife Mother Wren. Here, still, everything from nothing, home.